Well, welcome, Claire, and congratulations on the solo debut. It seems almost funny to say that, given how long you've been making music. Tell us about Sotto Voce.
It came through studying and yeah, I guess before that there's a record that I made with Tony, and there was more study and there was more, working in film and TV on little indie budget kind of films, small budget films and TV productions. And then yeah, this one I guess I kind of wanted to work with history and think about, I guess, kind of transporting the past into the present. And because the way that I make music, it's very like, I mean, this seems showy, but this is just the computer in the studio. And it looks very small, but those instruments are quite large. But, like the process that I take is quite tactile. So that idea of touching the past, I guess I wanted to explore. And I guess with that record with Tony, it kind of opened me up to um, ideas about women in music, I guess, and how they're frequently minimized. Or in the case of these two women that I looked at, it was how, yeah, I mean, they were fine in their own time. It was just, it's in the baroque era. So it's not common, but it was a thing that happened and they were supported in their time. But yeah, thinking about what happened through time as time progressed after they died, even, and how that's when it happens. I think it's that documenting of what's important about music or who fits in kind of thing. So yeah, it was all exploring all of those kind of, I guess, a historic starting point really, and a tactile starting point, and then it just grew as it started.
You're talking about Francesca Caccini and Barbara Strozzi, a pair of 17th century composers. How did you come across them?
They wouldn't have crossed paths. I think some people like to make up little narratives that maybe they did, but they wouldn't have. I mean, it wasn't even Italy at that point. You had the different regions, and Caccini, she was in Florence with the Medici powerful family there, and so she was employed as a teacher there and a performer, composer, creating lots of music all the time for court and performing it. She's a virtuosic singer, but also multi-instrumentalist. Her father was famous as well, so she kind of had that, and that's what happened to her through time. She kind of, it was mostly her father that was considered innovative or whatever. But yeah, I mean, she wrote a lot of music and a lot of it doesn't survive. There's a songbook that she created in 1618 and got it published. And so that's the main one that survived. And then an opera, and that gets contested. Is it an opera? If it's an opera, then maybe it's the first opera full stop, or is it maybe not? And is it the first opera by a woman? But there's all these kind of exciting, like, potential exceptional stories about her. But I like the idea of not doing that as well, because I think that's where women start dropping out, because they might not fit into this kind of idea of the genius, or whatever it might be. I just tried to not do that, even though I wanted to find out all that juicy trivia. So yeah, I feel like her story was really interesting, and Strozzi's was different. She also had an influential father. He was a poet, so he wrote a lot of her libretto at the start of her lyrics. And she was in Venice, and she's quite incredible because she didn't have a patron like Caccini and like a lot of composers, even up until Mozart and Beethoven, like you kind of have a patron. That's how you survived. But she didn't. And I think she might have had around about 8 different collections of works published, and all of them are through different sources. So she's kind of freelancer, I guess. So she's, yeah, I think in that way, she's an exception as well. And apparently she had the most secular publication, printed music in her time. But I didn't learn about her at uni when I was studying. I didn't even hear about her until I started doing this recent project.
I don't want to give listeners the impression that this is a baroque sounding record. I mean, I can feel that influence, but it is very much a modern recording. How did you strike that balance?
I guess it starts with drawing on instrumentation from that time. I again, that kind of touching the past kind of idea. So I worked with a couple of historic informed performers. So Lizzie Welsh was my main performer, and so she played baroque violin, treble viola da gamba, and viola d'amore, and that's what we started with. And it was in this church space that Tony and I were living in, and it was through lockdown. We were kind of like half out there, and then it was a creative space, but we were desperate for that kind of escape. So we had that space. So it was very much about getting her to record these little bits and pieces of the music. We just chose a bunch at random, really, of pieces by Caccini and Strozzi, and I just got her to play through them. So that was the starting point. And so you've already got that very different timbre, very different tone color happening at the very beginning, I think, anyway. And because she performs in a certain way as well, we have that as a starting point. But then I think I don't know what I'm doing half the time. And then so all these mistakes are happening because I'm producing myself. I'm just making it up as I go, going to tape, doing weird things in Pro Tools by accident that aren't, with plugins or things like that. It's just, like one thing I just kept doing was, I think it's shift and spacebar, and it plays it back at slow speed. So I think that's at half speed. And so I took that to tape, but then I'd slow the tape down multiple times as well, and then send it back to Pro. So it just sonically, I think it's doing something beyond the Baroque world. But I think, maybe it's the notation, the instrumentation, and the way that the original recordings were performed by Lizzie. And then, overdubbing with different performers and different instruments.
The tech does lend itself to that kind of play, which stands in contrast for me to something I sense about you. You're classically trained, you have a graduate degree, and there's a very measured approach that you take to the work, it seems to me. So help me understand that contrast. You seem to have arrived as a fully formed artist, and there's a kind of precision to your work.
I guess it's very deliberate. And with that project, it was for study, it was for a master's. And so I got to really reflect and refine. I had some time to think about it. And it is all unfolding. Like I definitely have training, but I still just feel like an untrained musician. I don't love reading music or writing music. It's all by ear or feel. So I guess it's just I had time. I was given time to create something, and that was it's just a lot of listening, a lot of iteration, so that some of the pieces, they just came very quickly, and they're the ones that I think are most conceptually interesting. But maybe I don't know if they're the pieces that people are enjoying the most, but some of those came very quickly, and others it just took a very long time, like probably over that year of studying and thinking and making and reflecting and all of that kind of stuff. I think some of them took almost that time to, and almost the shape might have been there, but it was just like some of those timbres of the early instruments were just so wild. And then in the recording space, and because we were using weird microphone setups with hi-fi and lo-fi microphones, and it just, anything that was shrill just got amplified, and I was reamping into that space with that multiple mic setup as well. So like it just, it became quite a beast and a beastly sound at times. So like, yeah, I think there were about 2 pieces that just took a long time to pull together into something that I liked, and but it was always evolving. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I spent that whole time planning and preparing. I think it just evolved in the process of doing it.
Is it a kind of tinkering process, or would you actually describe yourself as a perfectionist?
I think it's very weird, but I think I'm on either side of the spectrum. I think I'm either just like, yeah, that's pretty good. I like that, like, because I like sloppiness, I like looseness, I like mistakes. But then, yeah, I think definitely with pre-mixing and then mixing alongside Tony as well, I think that was going the perfectionist route because, yeah, it was wild. Like some of the sound was just so crazy. That sounds really exciting, and maybe it's not an exciting record. Really, it's quite gentle. But yeah, it took a long time to wrangle, I guess. So maybe that's a perfectionist. Maybe someone else might have been ready to throw it out there at a certain point. But yeah, it's very hard. Um, I feel like that spectrum of being, yeah, perfectionist or happy with the sloppiness and mistakes, it just runs through this whole record of like having two really opposing forces, like wanting it to sound beautiful and sensual and wanting to completely reject what femininity has to be or sound like. And there's all this kind of stuff, and I didn't really know how to be in the middle of it all because it was like I was contradicting myself all the time.
This is a recurring theme that comes up with artists that I talk to. There's a kind of disinterest these days in work that sounds overly polished. But I haven't heard that discussed in the context of femininity before.
Well, yeah, and because I got to think about these two women, and it was very much about how they looked as well and how they presented themselves. And because women, it was an anomaly, like you couldn't really see a lot of women performing or composing, definitely at that time. Like it was banned, it wasn't virtuous in many parts of the world, um and certainly where they were from. But it was also a very experimental time for music, so they were kind of excited by this risque spectacle at that time. So yeah, I read nice stories about women performing behind screens in, I think it was in churches in Venice, because you definitely weren't allowed to be in the church performing, but performing instruments, like maybe it was some kind of horn instrument that was just not related to femininity at all. And so not able to be seen playing that instrument even back then is pretty interesting. I think you can play the harp, you can sing, you could play the theorbo, maybe a stringed instrument. Yeah, but a horn.
You've talked about Tony a couple of times. You two collaborated on the 2020 release, The Old Capital. How does that compare to Sotto Voce?
I guess that one, it started out being a bit more playful probably, and trying to work out how to be together. And at that point, that was definitely about me going, oh, maybe I could do music not for someone else. Maybe I could make music for myself and see what happens. And yeah, I think we're very similar in how we think about music and how we record and approach music. Very much about being in your own hands and not getting too fussed about gear or anything like that. It's more about playing and feel and how it sounds. And yeah. So I think it was a dialogue, definitely that one. And this one is as well. And this one is about dialoguing with the space, because it was such a special space, and the performers and their instruments, but also this past context as well. And I guess this one was just infused with lots of ideas from the start, whereas the one with Tony and I, it unfolded, and we would get into the recording space and we would just start creating stuff and then building upon it. Whereas this one, I think every piece I had some kind of idea that I was exploring specifically beyond the music as well.
There's a kind of contemplativeness that I hear on both records, plenty of emotion, but a sort of thoughtfulness.
I think I was listening to Sotto Voce this evening just to remember. And yeah, I was surprised at the space that I created. Like I could really, and I think again it was because I was thinking about the baroque and thinking about tension and release that they achieved, or restraint and this wildness and restraint. And yeah, I could really hear the restraint, and I felt a bit proud about that. Which I'm not sure if, I think with the old Capitol it was all like, yes, let's just like play, let's get all the instruments that we have and let's just have fun and play. So I'm not sure if there's that pullback moment as much. So yeah, it'd be interesting to listen to it and think about this idea of yeah, what was your word that you used?
Yeah, thoughtfulness. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that that the work is overdone or overthought. There's a kind of precision, I guess.
Definitely. I mean, the old Capitol as well, when we took a long time arranging it. Like I make it sound as if we just got in there and jammed. It was very much not that. We did, and there were layers and layers, but it was also layers and layers of pulling things back and revealing and creating different segues into something else. And yeah, I think that, I mean, for Tony, that would come from production, I assume, and a different place to me. For me, it comes from film, where I'm not using MIDI in film, and I think that's to my own detriment in a way. It comes from playing, and so I just have to overdub, and I'm not an expert virtuosic player on anything. So overdubbing, and Tony, I think Tony would agree with that too, that overdubbing is key for us because we have all these beautiful sounds that we can create, and overdubbing just allows you to build and be as grand as you like, but then there's just that art to digging in within that and pulling out a really interesting arrangement. So yeah, I think definitely I can hear that as a thread between the two instrument, or between the two albums, definitely.
What motivates you to make music?
It's fun. I think it's really enjoyable. Yeah, I think it's another world that you tap into, and I think with the recent record, it's definitely about tapping into a different world and trying to understand it on my own terms, I think, rather than just picking up a history book and going, okay, I think I get an idea of that. But yeah, it's really transporting into another time and place. And that doesn't have to translate to the next person. That's very much my own intimate version of what I think that history was. So I love all that. And then I love that it has a capacity to change people, whether it's just their mood or, yeah, I think with the recent record, I feel like because it was, for me anyway, it was just infused with a lot of feminist theory as well, feminist perspectives. And so I think I've been able to talk about that, or not even me talk about it. I think people picking up on that through the music, or I guess through the extensive liner notes and all of the information that's out there. I love that you can kind of push for a little bit of empathy as well through music. I don't have to say it in words. It's yeah, you feel it.
And what's next for you?
Well, I want to make something that's a bit joyous and full of life and bounce and playfulness. So I think Tony and I will start making a record together again, which I think will be really fun. And there's a few different collaborations that I'll work on in the new year. And yeah, I have lots of plans for another solo, but I just have to start working out what it is exactly. But I really like this idea of playing with history and handling history and having your own version of history. But I don't know what it would be next. I have to start thinking.